Hey everyone, let's talk about fractions. Fractions are a fundamental part of mathematics and they help us understand how to divide things into smaller, equal parts. They might seem tricky at first, but once you get the hang of them, they can be really fun and useful. You know those yummy pizzas you love to share with friends? Imagine you have one large pizza and you want to share it equally among four friends. Each friend would get 1/4 of the pizza. That 1/4 is a fraction, representing one part of the four equal parts of the whole pizza. Or maybe you bake cookies with your family and divide them up. If you bake a dozen cookies and want to share them with 3 family members, each person would get 4 cookies. Here, each person's share is a fraction of the total number of cookies. Well, fractions help us understand and talk about parts of a whole. For example, if you have a pie chart that shows how you spend your day, each section of the chart is a fraction of your entire day. It visually represents how much time you spend on different activities. It's like slicing a cake into equal pieces. Each piece represents a fraction of the whole cake. If you cut a cake into 8 equal slices, each slice is 1/8 of the cake. This helps you see how fractions can be used to divide things into equal parts. Fractions are everywhere in our daily lives, not just in the kitchen. When you're cooking, you might need to measure out 1/2 cup of sugar or a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. These measurements are fractions that help you get the recipe just right. Ever notice the fuel gauge in your car? It shows how much fuel is left in the tank using fractions. It uses fractions to show how much gas is left. For example, if the gauge is at 1/2, it means the tank is half full. This helps you know when it's time to refuel, or think about sharing your favorite candy bar with a friend. You'll need to use fractions to divide it fairly. If you split it into 2 equal parts, each person gets 1/2 of the candy bar. Fractions are like little math detectives that help us measure and divide things up. They can be used in so many different ways, from dividing a pizza to measuring ingredients for a recipe to understanding how much fuel is left in your car. So get ready to dive into the exciting world of fractions. We'll explore how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. We'll also learn about equivalent fractions, which are different fractions that represent the same part of a whole. We'll learn all the cool tricks and techniques to become fraction masters in no time. With practice, you'll be able to solve fraction problems quickly and easily. Trust me, once you understand fractions, you'll see them everywhere, and math will become even more fun and exciting. Whether you're cooking, sharing, or just measuring things, fractions will help you make sense of the world around you. So let's get started and discover the amazing world of fractions together. Before we jump into the fun stuff, let's meet the two heroes of our fraction story, the numerator and the denominator. These two numbers are essential in understanding how fractions work and how they represent parts of a whole. Think of them as the dynamic duo of the fraction world. Just like Batman and Robin, they work together to solve problems and make sense of the world around us. They work together to tell us exactly what portion of a whole we're dealing with. Without both the numerator and the denominator, we wouldn't be able to understand fractions at all. The numerator is the number on top of the fraction line. It's the part of the fraction that tells us how many parts we have or are interested in. It tells us how many parts we have. For example, if we have a fraction like 3/4, the numerator is 3, which means we have 3 parts out of the whole. Imagine a plate with 6 delicious cookies. If you were to take some of those cookies, the numerator would tell you how many you took. If you take 2 cookies, you've taken 2 out of 6, which we write as the fraction 2/6. Here, the numerator is 2 because you took 2 cookies. The 2 here is our mighty numerator. It shows the part of the whole that we're focusing on. Now, let's meet the denominator, the number below the fraction line. The denominator is just as important as the numerator. This guy tells us the total number of equal parts that make up the whole. Without the denominator, we wouldn't know how many parts the whole is divided into. In our cookie example, the denominator is 6 because there are 6 cookies in total. It tells us the total number of parts we're dealing with. See? Numerator and denominator always working together. They are like 2 sides of the same coin, each one essential to understanding the whole picture. Remember this, the numerator is like the part we're interested in, and the denominator is the whole thing. The numerator tells us how many parts we have, and the denominator tells us how many parts make up the whole. Once you understand these two, you're well on your way to conquering fractions. With practice, you'll be able to use numerators and denominators to solve all kinds of fraction problems. So keep practicing, and soon you'll be a fraction master. Let's imagine we have a chocolate bar divided into 12 equal squares. This delicious bar represents our whole. Now, if we break off one square, we have 1/12 of the chocolate bar. See how we use the fraction 1/12 to represent that one piece out of 12? Now, let's say we break off 4 squares. That's 4/12 of the chocolate bar, meaning we have 4 parts out of the total 12. The bigger the numerator, the more pieces we have of our whole chocolate bar. Fractions are like building blocks. They help us understand and represent parts of a whole in a clear and simple way. Just like you wouldn't build a house without a strong foundation, you can't master math without understanding fractions. Section 4, fraction addition and subtraction, combining the pieces. Adding and subtracting fractions is like putting together or taking away pieces of our chocolate bar. The key is to make sure all the pieces are the same size before we add or subtract. Let's say we want to add 1/4 of the chocolate bar to 2/4 of the chocolate bar. It's like combining one square with 2 squares, giving us a total of 3/4 of the chocolate bar. Notice how the denominator stays the same because we're still talking about the same whole chocolate bar divided into fourths. Subtracting is similar. If we start with 3/4 of the chocolate bar and eat 1/4, we're left with 2/4. Just remember, the denominator stays the same unless we're changing the size of the pieces, which we'll learn about later. Section 5, unlocking equivalent fractions, different looks, same value. Here's a cool secret about fractions. They can have different names and still represent the same amount, just like you might have a nickname. Imagine you have a friend named Jonathan, but everyone calls him John. No matter what name you use, it's still the same person. Fractions work in a similar way. They might look different, but they can still be equal in value. These sneaky lookalikes are called equivalent fractions. They are fractions that may appear different, but actually represent the same part of a whole. For example, 1/2 is the same as 2/4, 3/6, or even 4/8. They all mean the same thing, just expressed in different ways. Let's imagine cutting our chocolate bar in half. When you break it into 2 equal pieces, each piece is 1/2 of the whole bar. This is a simple way to visualize fractions. Now we have 2 equal pieces, and each piece represents 1/2 of the whole bar. This is easy to understand because we can see that each piece is exactly half of the original chocolate bar. But what if we cut each half into 2 more equal pieces? Now, instead of 2 pieces, we have 4 smaller pieces. Each of these pieces is 1/4 of the whole bar. Now we have 4 pieces, and each piece is 1/4 of the whole bar. Even though the pieces are smaller, they still add up to the same amount of chocolate as before. Here's the cool part. Even though we cut the bar into smaller pieces, 1/2 and 2/4 still represent the same amount of chocolate. This is because 1/2 and 2/4 are equivalent fractions. They look different but are equal in value. They are equivalent fractions, different names for the same value. This concept is very useful in math because it helps us understand that fractions can be simplified or expanded without changing their value. We can find equivalent fractions by multiplying or dividing the numerator and denominator by the same number. For example, if we multiply the numerator and denominator of 1/2 by 2, we get 2/4. If we divide the numerator and denominator of 4/8 by 4, we get 1/2. This process helps us see that fractions can be expressed in many different ways, but their value remains the same. Understanding equivalent fractions is a key skill in math. It allows us to simplify complex problems and find common denominators when adding or subtracting fractions. By recognizing that different fractions can represent the same value, we can become more confident and proficient in our math skills. So remember, even though fractions might look different, they can still be equal. Just like how John and Jonathan are the same person, 1/2 and 2/4 are the same amount. Keep practicing and soon you'll be a fraction expert. Section 6, simplifying fractions, finding the most elegant form. Sometimes fractions can be a bit messy, like a room full of toys scattered everywhere. Simplifying fractions is like tidying up that room. We're making the fraction look neater and easier to work with without changing its value. Imagine we have the fraction 4/8. Both the numerator and denominator share a common factor of 4. If we divide both by 4, we get 1/2. See how much neater that looks? And guess what? 4/8 and 1/2 are equivalent fractions. They represent the same amount. Simplifying fractions is all about finding those common factors and dividing them out. It's like finding the most elegant outfit in a messy closet. It's still the same clothes, just presented in a more stylish way.